Thanks for coming along here. I'm going to do this in English. I was asked to do this in English. How many English speakers have we got here, actually? Well, it's 2, 3. Good. But for Icelanders, at least, stop me if I'm going too fast, and we'll have a chance to discuss some things in Icelandic if you want afterwards. Of course, this exhibition here goes back to this collection here of folk tales put together by Jón Árnason, and Magnus Grímsson, before he died, was also involved in it. Two collections, actually. One little one called Íslensk Ævintýri, which was really, it's not really fairy tales as it suggests, more a collection of legends. And then the big collection, which they started together, and Jón Árnason finished later on. 2 volumes, and then become 6 volumes. So this material that we have here in this wonderful exhibition really goes back to that collection, and it's that collection that if we find translations of folk tales, they all come from this collection. There's a lot of other materials that have come out since, but they all go back to this. What I'd like to do here largely is to show really that many of the stories that we have here, which we almost we see them as being 19th century stories, are in fact still being told in new versions around Iceland today. And it hasn't changed as much as some people might expect. And certainly the same applies to folk beliefs in Iceland, which I want to look at in particular here. People's experiences and people's beliefs, and especially a survey of folk beliefs that we did in Iceland about 10 years ago, which says quite a lot of interesting things. So, as one might understand, Iceland's a little bit behind the rest of the world when it comes to the arrival of summer, and at least the foreigners here will have noticed this. While flowers are springing up like mad elsewhere, Icelanders are still wearing 5 pullovers and fighting off blizzards. It means that Icelanders, especially people like me, have to look out for other signs than flowers to prove that the summer's actually coming. And for me, there are 2 signs that always stand out. One of them is the arrival of wasps, and Icelanders being chased around the landscape by wasps. They're terrified of wasps. The other is the arrival of foreign journalists from Italy and France and Japan who knock on my door asking for information about the Icelandic belief in álfar, or elves. Now, it could be said that the roots of this chat here lie in my increasing irritation with these journalists, nice as they are, who all seem to imagine that every Icelandic house has an elf rock outside it. They're images of something like this when we're looking at the elves. The idea that almost every Icelandic family goes out spending every Friday night dancing around elf rocks with their elf friends. But the reason for why these journalists have been drawn to this idea actually goes back to a very basic survey that was done in the newspaper Dagblaðið back in the 70s, where they asked a simple question: do you believe in elves or not? And suddenly we get 50% of Icelanders believing in elves. There wasn't any question of sort of belief or strong or weak belief. That's what you see when you're on Flying with Icelander. 50% of Icelanders believe in elves. Then we have this large survey, national survey into Icelandic folk beliefs and belief attitudes that was done in 1974. Now, that survey was carried out by the Icelandic psychologist Erlendur Haraldsson, who was primarily interested in the experiences of those who said that they'd come into contact with spirits of the dead, their deceased relations. But he added other questions about other kinds of beliefs. You can see here, basically, we have things like dreaming, sensing people from a big distance, astral travel, memories of earlier lives, and things of that kind. Now, among other things, the results of the survey suggested that while very few Icelanders believed strongly in nature spirits, just as few were actually ready to deny their existence. We can see that one basically here. Here's the question on sort of huldufólk and álfar. Completely out of the question, 10%. Totally sure that they exist, 7%. But in between, you've got all of these other percentages, which suggest that they're open to their existence. More striking, though, but less noted, was the very high level of belief of Icelanders in dreams, in the idea of fylgjur, or accompanying spirits, and the possibility, as we see here, of the continuing contact with the dead. And that led to quite a lot of discussion in a number of articles in Iceland around this time about what's meant by belief, folk belief, and other things of this kind. Now, of course, Iceland itself has changed radically in the last 40 years. Over that time, it's managed to move itself from the sort of 19th century world here, managed to move itself and dive into the 20th century, 21st century, managed to raise itself up to having one of the highest living standards in Iceland, in Europe, and within the space of a year managed to totally bankrupt itself and then pull itself back into life again in just a space of another few years. These aren't what you call normal people when it comes down to it. Nonetheless, there was naturally very good reason to be wary about whether the figures from Erlender's survey from 1970 were still applicable to the Iceland of the 21st century. We therefore applied to the University of Iceland for funding to carry out a new, extended survey into Icelandic beliefs, their belief attitudes, and their experiences of the supernatural. That was in 2006. Application was well received, and the new questionnaire was sent out by the Félagsvísindastofnun, or Social Science Institute, at the University of Iceland that summer. But the questionnaire in question contained over 50 questions dealing with a whole range of phenomena, ranging from experiences of ghosts, astral travel, UFOs, to beliefs in accompanying spirits, elves, the power of dreams, and God. And the questions were based on those asked by Icelander 30 years before, and now had additional material aimed at providing more detail, at bringing the questionnaire into line with modern society that had been into contact with New Age thought by that time. Certain other questions that were seen as being no longer relevant and outdated were dropped. The survey questionnaire was sent to 1,500 people. Only 600 answered initially. Key problem seems to be that people these days are simply not as willing as they were to answer and resend postal questionnaires of this kind. And we were naturally worried that this 600 people who answered might be unrepresentative of Iceland. Perhaps they were simply people who loved answering questionnaires when they had nothing else to do, or were simply interested in the supernatural. So that's why in 2007, we asked all of our students in folkloristics, each of them to take 10 questionnaires each, to give them to a representative group of people, different ages, different sexes, from different parts of the country, people they saw as being pretty normal types within their family or their social circle. We then asked the students to make sure that these people returned the forms whether they were interested in the subject or not. This meant that from this group we would definitely get a more representative selection of answers. 400 new answers came in, giving us now a total of about 1,000. And most interesting was that the figures from this new collection of answers from 2007 were actually exactly the same as those from 2006, which meant statistically that there was good reason to trust the official survey from 2006 as being typical. Striking results that came from both surveys was that while Icelandic society had changed vastly over 35 years, belief attitudes, the cultural vocabulary of the supernatural in Iceland had clearly remained pretty static. In other words, traditional beliefs seem to have remained quite deeply rooted. You can see here the difference with the elf beliefs, between 74 and 2006. There's not that much difference going on in the changes here. So let's quickly run over some of the main findings of this survey, which you can find online if you're interested. And we can start with experiences, and just to show you how to read these. This here means, yes, I've had experience of these things. The sort of scarlet area is no. So simply we can run through that quite quickly. So do you have dreams telling you of the future, meaning not psychological dreams, but dreams that give you access to the future and the other world? Quite a lot of people here we have 39%, 40% of Icelanders say this happens to them quite regularly. Sense of omen, this should have been certainly they should have followed this one up before the banking crash. The sense of something bad is going to happen any minute. Strong number of Icelanders. Maybe it's just because they're pessimistic by nature, I'm not really sure, but an element of the future is out there. You can read it in some sense. You can get some sense of something that's going to happen. The presence of the dead, again, we're dealing with about 40% here, that you can sense dead people around you, this sort of sixth sense, I can feel the dead. Haunted houses is about a quarter, just over, more young people than older people on these, but certainly this is a growing aspect for people who have experience of haunted houses at some point in their lives. Fylgjur, actually what we mean here is not belief, but have you ever bumped into a fylgja, to a following spirit of somebody else, or have you ever seen your own? Not so many here, but nonetheless a number of people. Have you used a spirit doctor? This is particularly interesting for Icelanders. You don't find this in other countries. It's for those people who don't know Iceland, spirit doctors, basically, if you have a member of the family who is particularly ill, and you're almost giving up on the doctors, and you contact somebody who has contact with a spirit doctor on the other side. And the story usually is that you ask them to come to check out the person who is ill, and many stories tell about the person who is ill feeling something going on in the night while they're being checked out. So there's quite a lot of people here who've gone for spirit doctors in Iceland. Naming children after dreams, nafnavitjun in Iceland. This is, again, have you done this? And you'll see that belief figures are much higher. But I'd say, on the whole, any class of Icelanders I ask, how many of you know somebody who's been named after a dream, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, or you've been named yourself after a dream. I'd say about a third of the class will tend to do this. You don't find it in other countries. Elves and hidden people, how many people have bumped into an elf on Laugavegur? Very few, when it comes down to it. It's not a high number of people. Have you seen a UFO? Even less. However drunk Icelanders get, they don't see UFOs. It's not a common Icelandic activity. Modern beliefs, out of the question. There are other things they bump into. Okay, so belief attitudes then, if we go into these. And what you have to do here is look at the figure here on the right. It's on a 1 to 5 scale. No belief at all would be 1, and complete belief is going to be 5. So what we're looking at especially are the ones over 2.5, which show, and there is a difference, as you'll see here in a minute. Most interesting are those which have a figure of over 3, and we get telepathy here, for example, as one of them. Some people do have the ability to see into the future is the next one that follows at the bottom. Again, 3.3 in many cases here. You've got the two surveys, 2006, 2007. Go on to here, the ability to sense the dead and dreams, again, very, very high, on the edge of 4 in many cases. Here, 3.6 in both cases. Next one here, the ability to actually see the dead, that the dead can appear to people. Next one here is the idea of is there life after death? Again, it was pretty high, 3.5 heading towards 4 Icelandic beliefs. This next one here, we have contact can be made with the dead at meetings with clairvoyance. People believe this can take place. And then haunted houses, as we've met before, quite a high figure, but more children, more younger people than others. Then we go on to here to the idea of power spots in nature. I translate this as power points. It's álagablettir for Icelanders. It's a place in the countryside that on farms, you never touch. We'll come back to that one in a minute later on. But certainly, right around the countryside, you're going to find this on most farms. We've looked at that in particular in later times. And then underneath this element of, do you believe that this idea of naming your children because of a supernatural message coming through dreams, that's also in the 3.2 scale. There's also quite a strong belief, as I say, in following spirits, which we get here, accompanying spirits. These are either, I've broken this up into two groups here, which weren't in 1974. These are family spirits that follow family members. These are spirits you're born with, as a sort of fylgjur, personal fylgjur. Then we go on to attitudes to God, which are particularly interesting for Iceland. This is from the international survey that was done in 2000. It hasn't changed much since. Iceland, looking first of all, how often do Icelanders go to church? Icelanders, you know this, hardly ever. How many people, not, on the other hand, believe in God? On our survey, we deliberately had several types of God. The one that's strongest, 45%, is clearly the Christian God. And it goes up even higher than this in other places. The other ones here, there's no God, or it's a God that creates the earth, or a natural God, or things of this kind. Also interesting here, we find the same sort of thing in the human value surveys, with Iceland here way up into sort of 84% in terms of the Christian God, and very much like a place like Ireland and other Catholic countries. And again, you can see here the types of God that's involved. Here's Iceland. It's a sort of personal God of some kind. Particularly interesting too is that Icelanders, obviously from this survey, believe very strongly in heaven. They don't believe in hell. They believe in God. They don't believe in Satan, but they do believe in sin, which is wonderful. That basically, for the Icelandic attitude from this is that you can sin as much as you like and you go to heaven, which explains partly, again, the financial crash when we come down to it. Okay, if we come back on to here, belief in the hidden people or the álfar has reduced a little bit, but nonetheless does underline that Icelanders are still as open to the possibility of their existence as people in the west of Ireland, for example. Particularly interesting is the fact that Icelanders seem to have comparatively little belief at all in new spirits that have come to the country with the New Age, or before that from Danish influence, like UFOs, for example, and then Dobby the house elf, which from Rowling, which Icelanders don't do. It's a foreign one. The idea of reincarnation is something else that has never been really strong with Icelanders. Now, if we go on to this idea of the belief in haunted houses, that, I would say, seems to be more related to the fact, if we're not questioning people's beliefs, but simply looking at why it should be higher with young people than with older people, I'd say it's more that nowadays there are more houses that have a history that are unknown to occupants than they used to have in the past. Icelanders are living in houses more often in Reykjavik that if they've moved into, they've got no idea who used to live there before or what happened there before. It used to be within the family. And in the countryside, we have a lot of empty eyðibýli, which are left around there. And there's the influence of Hollywood, of course. It's nonetheless very clear that young people are more open to such ideas than the old, and in general, it's clear that those beliefs here that are strongest in fate, ghosts, dreams, accompanying spirits, nature spirits, all of these ones have very deep roots going back to the time of the settlement of Iceland in the 9th century. They're all found in the medieval Icelandic sagas, and they reappear not only in the 19th century, but in all of our surveys. Some have gone, some seem to flourish in the glare of the electric light. It does suggest that maybe through the reading of sagas and so on, that these beliefs are kept going quite deeply within the Icelandic psyche. So then, the survey shows that beliefs, belief systems, cultural vocabulary actually change very, very slowly in spite of vast social change. But what's this got to do with folk narratives, the sort of thing that we're seeing around the room here? Well, as you've seen from the PowerPoints, we didn't just ask about belief attitudes, but experiences. And related to all of these, we also asked those people who answered our survey anonymously whether they would be prepared to talk to us in detail about their experiences and their attitudes. A large number gave us telephone numbers and emails, and that led on to really the next stage of the project. Now, naturally, a quantitative survey of this kind in terms of numbers, looking at numbers gives a useful overview of worldview, but it doesn't actually give much depth, nor does it explain exactly what people mean when they say they believe or they don't believe, when they say that they have had a supernatural experience. To get such information, we need a quantitative survey needs to be accompanied by what we call qualitative research in terms of interviews. And certainly a number of my students then went off and took interviews with some of these people with some very interesting results. To say they weren't only collecting stories of experiences with a view to analysing how people talk about the experiences, but also asking them to talk about how they understood the world of belief. And not surprisingly, such discussions also tended to lead to even more personal experiences as people try to explain why they believe or why they don't believe or things of this kind. There's always a story when they say they have had an experience or they have a belief. In short, as we've always known, people use stories as a way of explaining their attitudes and their understandings of the world. And as scholars like de Sesto and others have noted, these stories, in a sense, are the clothes that are worn by the landscape that we live in. They tell us, the stories tell us how to behave within the landscape, but they give it a strong sense of history and mysticism and things of this kind. They give it character, mystery, and depth. They also govern the way that we behave when we're in the landscape. But they come from us, and they come from our culture, they use our vocabulary, and they reflect our values. So let's take a look at a few examples of the kind of stories that were told to my students in connection with this survey that we did. And the particular interest here are those accounts of the supernatural, which to my mind have a particularly Icelandic character, in the sense that you don't find, there's a clear difference between some of the stories that you find in Scandinavia and those found around here. And especially here, we're talking about legends with strong, lucid, meaningful dreams, of encounters with family spirits or fylgjur, of contacts with the huldufolk, the hidden ones, or the álfar, the elves, the spirit doctors, and most particularly those that tell of so-called name visits, nafnavitjun, when people feel that they have to name their children, coming children or newborn, after somebody who appears to them in a dream. As I mentioned before, these kinds of legends have actually changed very, very little in form from those recorded in the first collections of folk tales from the 19th century, if not the Middle Ages. They also have recognized forms and shapes and a particular sort of vocabulary, as we'll see here. Are you still understanding me, by the way, Icelanders? Am I not too fast for you? Okay, good. Nobody's snoring yet. You're still around. So let's start with nafnavitjun, a particularly Icelandic phenomenon which was examined in some detail by a student of mine called Dagbjörg Guðmundsdóttir, and the dreams have been looked at by a Dutch anthropologist called Adriana Heijnen. As I've noted before, the idea is that the dead visit the living in dreams to ask for prospective children to be named after them. So here we have again the amount of experience stories of this, and here's the sort of story. We'll come back to that in just a second. It's a tradition that goes back actually to Viking times. One of the earliest accounts is in connection with St. Olavur in Norway of this type. The following account was told to Juliana Magnusdóttir by a woman born in 1924 from Skaftatungu in South Iceland. And she says, and I've changed the names in these, you've got the original Icelandic on the sheet if you want it. So, I can tell you one thing, she says, your late grandmother, your great-grandmother, she never wanted anyone to be named after her when she was alive. She banned your mother from doing this, and others, because she said this Halldóra name of hers never brought any luck with it. And as far as she knew it was anyway. And then, Mum didn't name anybody after her or anything of that kind. And then when Þorbjörg over at Garðar got pregnant with Halldór, then suddenly one night into the room in a dream came with a cradle between them your grandmother and her brother Gisli. And then the boy was, and they say that they were going to get to stay or something of that kind. And then the boy was called afterwards Guðmundur Halldór. That's what he was christened as. And then when I was going to christen my Inga, well, she was going to be called Inga Berglind and nothing else. But then I dreamt of your grandmother, late Halldóra, and I was, of course, one of her favourites, and she asked me to allow her to stay, leið mér að vera. And I say to her, well, I'd like to have let her stay, but actually it's a bit cramped in my place. I couldn't really. couldn't find place for her. And then she said, I don't need much room, really. And she was so sad because I wasn't going to allow her to stay. I don't need much room, she said. And then we started talking about this because Inga had asked for her to be named after her. Inga Berglind Halldóra, that's a huge name. That can't be, that's not possible, I say. And so I said that she didn't want much. It could be just the H and the A in the name. And then I say, well, what about Inga Berglind Hafdís? That would work, of course. And that was what the girl was christened. And then we decided to christen her like this, and I dreamt of her again, and now she was dancing. She was so happy. She was dancing all over the floor. So here we have this sort of idea. And the key features of these name visiting accounts, which are usually told by women as memorats, meaning that these are memory stories of theirs, local legends, of the idea that the mother is to be visited in a dream by the person in question who asks to stay, either leib mér að vera, either lof mér að vera, always the same words. The story then continues with comments about whether they followed this or not, and the results of this. As this speaker and other informants underline, if you ignore the visitor, that can have dire consequences, something that's sometimes followed up in the story and backs up the tradition even further. Icelanders, do you know of anybody who's named after a dream? There you go. Jesus, 3 of you. This, for the international people, you see it immediately. They'll tell you later on. Okay, so we go on to another aspect here. This is the idea of the power spots in nature. As I say, then, with these here, very few people, what's interesting is that the experience is very little, but the belief is very high. Hence, what happens, as when I went into the country with some teacher friends of mine, we were going to go and look at álagabletted PowerPoints around the country, I suggested we should take a spade with us to see what happened. And none of them agreed to do this. Nobody was going to touch any of these places. You never know what might happen. And so basically there's no experience, but there's a hell of a lot of belief. Hence, nobody's going to touch a place like this. You don't mess with fate. And just to give you a sort of example of this, here we have the experiences. And here we have an álagabletted story, which is actually collected by Bjarni Harðarson down in the south of the country, and shows how these stories are updating themselves in a really interesting way. It used to be that the farm would burn, or horses would die, or cattle would die if you touched this place. Now this is a story from Bjarni, as I say. At Blessastad, there's a curse on Grænhóll, that it must never be mown, the grass must never be cut there. The area closest to that little hill, Hólur, must be left alone. Nothing must be touched, and its inhabitants mustn't be disturbed. The belief being that hidden people live in them. Ingibjörg Jóhannsdóttir, the farmer at Blessastad, told the author that this belief has been respected, even though her husband hasn't paid much attention to superstitions like this. Ingibjörg and her daughter Hildur said that they'd always respected this as a kind of sacred space. All the same, one time there was talk of flattening that little hill, and a bulldozer was brought in, one of the sort of jarðýta, was brought in to carry it out. It was standing by the stable door when those on the farm went to sleep, the idea being that work would begin next day. That night, the bulldozer caught fire, and they dropped all ideas of flattening the hillock after that. Other times you hear about car accidents and things of this kind happening in modern beliefs. So they're updating themselves quite effectively, but they live on. Now, dreams telling of the future. As the survey shows here, a lot of Icelanders have experience of dreams telling of the future. And Adriana Heinen underlined in her PhD, Icelanders often see dreams as being much more than just dreams. In the Middle Ages, they're often seen by many Icelanders as a way of getting insight into the future, and same applies today. They're also a means by which people can be contacted by the dead or by nature spirits who want to pass on comments about building work, for example. Now here are the sort of belief figures again that we've had. And the account that follows, dealing with both prophetic dreams and nature spirits, was told to one of my students by a woman born in 1941 who came from the same area down south as the last. particularly interesting to note the words that she uses to frame her experience, which again are very typically Icelandic, and you can look at them again later on the original sheets later on. And she says something like this: before we moved up here, well, there had been some talk of buying this land, and then I dreamt that, well, to my mind, here north of Fyrirnan, the home field as it's called, and there, well, it seems to me, or I felt, and she says, mér þóttist is the usual expression, is a big hall. In it lives some woman who I couldn't be sure in my dream what she looked like exactly, but I talked to her, and I was somehow really nervous and worried, and she said to me something like this: as long as you believe in me, you'll have no worries. And then it seems to me, or I felt, mér þóttist, like without her saying it, that these were financial worries she was talking about. And it's so strange, I've often thought of this woman ever since, because often when you'd be thinking, there's no money left to buy anything, something's always come up, which has saved everything. And it's so strange that I asked the old farmer who was here when we moved here whether there were any huldufolk or fairies living anywhere now around here. No, he says, no knowledge of anything like that. But then he starts telling me about how, well, actually my dad, he was going to build a hut of some kind out beyond the field, up by that big rock over there. And he's putting down some stones, putting a foundation down on three sides. The rock was going to form one wall, and he was going to put down walls for the other ones. But he didn't go back to that because he dreamt something one night. And I said, it must be the woman who lives inside there. Didn't know anything about that. He says, never heard anything about her. But I'm of the belief that, she says, inside there is a very good woman in that rock. And that's the big house I dreamt of before moving here. So again, we see how Icelanders present their beliefs. Now, the traditional features of this story, in addition to the idea of lucid or prophetic dreams, is the involvement of the hidden woman in the story as being a sort of supernatural advisor, a dream woman, and the positioning of the hidden people's house on the edge, which happens in all of these stories, and then repeated expressions like mér þóttist, which goes right back to the Icelandic sagas when anybody's talking about a dream. It's language used a long time back and throughout all of the folk tales. It indicates the fact that this isn't a mere dream, but something rather close to reality and worth noting, even if uncertain. It's backed up by expressions like, it's really strange, really. Those are skrítið, underlining that they aren't really certain how to put this idea across. Okay, briefly then, two more archetypal accounts from the same sort of area. One is a sort of an account of an ættarfylgja. So here we have these accompanying spirits that people are born with, that I talked about before, and their experiences. But an ættarfylgja is something slightly different. It's a family spirit that follows members of one particular family. And we find this around. Icelanders don't have haunted houses normally in the past, but you do have haunted families and people who are followed by these sort of fylgjur. Usually follows members of the family over several generations, wherever they go, a bit like a sort of personified curse or bad luck. The following odd example is about a rather long-stretched dog that follows one family. And here's again the beliefs that we have here, quite high. And I've again changed the names here. And there's this case of Keli, for example. It followed that family, Gísli and Oddur, and Helgi at Ketilstaðir follow him too. He was followed by some sort of family spirit like this. And this Keli, he was a bit like a sort of dog. He was a kind of spotted dog, but he was on the long side. It was a bit like he was so long he was falling apart around the belly. And he was, very thin up to his backbone, like he was coming to pieces. And he followed Gísli over at Staðir, and there was a boy brought up by Gísli and Þóra who was called Oddur. And Keli, well, he was always ahead every time that Gísli came along. And my brother Mundi saw him. He could describe him completely. And he was really like a sort of long dog. And the dogs on the farms, they always went for this creature. But you never saw who they were going for. But whenever Gísli came, they always went for this being. And once, Fúsi, he was in the old farm, West Farm over at Helgafell, and he was sleeping in what they called the living room, and suddenly all the dogs came into the room attacking some creature he couldn't see. And he jumped up, threw them out, and they all went out. And he said they all headed up in a line up to the farm up at Gausat. And then he didn't hear anything else. And then a day later, Gisli, he went off to Gausat. And from Helgafell, he went over to Gausat. And like Minda said, he'd been, it was a stripy dog, really, a bit longer than most dogs, short-legged, and the belly was like it was coming apart around the thighs, at the back of the belly. It may well be that he's just fallen apart and come to pieces. But this was it always happened before Gisli arrived. Always some sort of small tricks or something like Fúsi. He had no belief in this sort of thing, but that's how it was. Some people are very much against this sort of thing. They always need to have some kind of proof. And finally then, a rather original ghost story. Again, as you see here, ghost experiences with Icelanders are pretty high. Now for Icelanders, here's the belief figures. For Icelanders today, like people elsewhere, ghost stories are very popular. But as a survey underlines, they echo a strong belief that the dead, the ancestors, really surround us. Now, the storyteller here talks about, again, a modern story, a ghost car known around her district. It was the ghost car of the old postman. Now, my student, who comes from the same area, begins by asking very basically, so you've heard movements outside? Oh, yes. Not always. I heard them in one particular house when I was a child. And then I heard movements which it said just hadn't existed. I saw and I heard the sound of a car, and the car never came, and there were no tracks left by it. I was told on the basis of the description I gave of the sound of the car, I wasn't much more than 10, 11 years old when that was. It was the car belonging to Benny at Hólar, who's dead, and there are many who've seen it. And it was so strange. I was up at Botn when that happened, and it was the western window by the living room, and I hear the car, and I tell Sigga that there are some visitors coming. And she's on her way out, and she had to do something in the shed out front, and she says, okay, I'll go and deal with it. And she goes, and the car should have arrived, but it didn't come. Nobody came. We go out and look for tracks, and there are no tracks. But you could hear it very clearly, and I could clearly describe it, and I'm pretty sure that car must have been scrapped ages before. So, just to end up with, these then are the kind of stories that were collected in connection with our belief survey. And what's striking is exactly how similar these belief stories are really informed to the accounts told to the collectors in the 19th and the 20th centuries. Certainly, the form of the printed legends that used to often be told aloud in the Icelandic farmhouses is bound to have affected the way that people explain their own experiences in terms of cultural vocabulary. But it should be remembered that most of these are new experiences which are being phrased and expressed in terms of the much older cultural vocabulary in the modern world. They're modern folk legends, but actually I very much doubt if you'd ever find any of them appearing in a collection of so-called contemporary legends in Iceland, because they're traditional. But they are nonetheless very much part of contemporary Icelandic society. The old stories are still being told, and they certainly serve to underline the fact that we should be very wary of talking about modern legends, urban legends, and country legends, and old legends. They're all being told together. They show that a truly representative collection of contemporary Icelandic legends would actually not be so different from those first collections that lie behind the pictures that we have in this room that were collected in the 19th century. We'll stop there. Thank you. Cheers.